Honourable Senators, I rise today to speak on Bill C-62, a bill to delay access to assisted suicide for Canadians with mental illness until 2027. This bill passed the House of Commons decisively by a vote of 272 to 32. And while I am supportive of this move to delay access now, I submit the Trudeau Government needs to not just delay expanding assisted suicide to people with mental illness, it needs to back down completely. Ideologically driven, the Trudeau Government seems allergic to admitting they made a grievous error in ever accepting MAID for mental illness in 2021. Canadians don't want this expansion. Our healthcare system is not ready for it. The Trudeau Government has recognized this and punted the issue to 2027, beyond the date of the next election, to try and ensure they don't have to face the electorate on this question. Liberal Health Minister Mark Holland has confirmed that even with the delay on Bill C-62, this expansion for mental illness will be a matter of not if, but when. But vulnerable Canadians living with mental illness will ultimately be the ones who pay the price for this pro-expansionist Liberal ideology with their lives. There are two significant reasons why mental illness should not qualify as a sole ground for accessing assisted suicide. First, it is very difficult, if not impossible, to determine irremediability of mental illness. Secondly, it is challenging for clinicians to distinguish whether the request for assisted suicide by someone with mental illness is motivated by suicidality, which can change from one day to the next and may be helped with treatment. Throughout my 8 years on the Senate's Legal Committee as we examined this very issue, we heard from many expert witnesses who relayed stories of their seemingly treatment-resistant patients who were able to recover from their mental illness and improve with the right treatment and resources. Mental illness is not irremediable. It is not terminal. MAID for mental illness is not, as Senators Kutcher, Meiji, and Wallen described it in their dissenting report, quote, end-of-life care. MAID for mental illness is access to the 100% lethal means of death delivered straight into the hands of someone with mental illness. I can tell you from personal experience as a caregiver to my late husband, Dave Batters, who struggled with mental illness, there are huge gaps in the mental health care system in this country. There are waiting lists of months, sometimes years, to get in to even see a psychiatrist. But the answer to gaps in the mental health care system is to fix that system, not to confirm a mentally ill patient's feelings of hopelessness and offer them the lethal means to suicide. The answer is certainly not to end their lives for them. It is also difficult to predict with certainty whether a patient's wish to die is the result of transient suicidality that may be a symptom of their mental illness, or whether it is a deliberate plan to end one's life. Not all suicide is impulsive. People with mental illness can also map out a detailed plan for their suicides, and many do. Often, mental illness produces a tunnel vision or lack of perspective about one's own life and its worth. It creates a complex environment in which to make a life or death decision like assisted suicide. Further, some psychiatric medications also have the side effect of increasing the frequency of suicidal thoughts. Suicide is arranging one's own death, as is MAID. But with MAID, you also involve the state. One of the reasons Canada outlawed capital punishment decades ago is that we decided a person's life is too high a cost if the state makes a mistake. In a recent article, Senator Kutcher was quoted as taking issue with the argument that MAID and suicide are similar. The article states, quote, "We can't equate someone who chooses to end their life due to mental illness to a kamikaze pilot or a suicide bomber," Kutcher explains. Quote, "They're not the same thing at all, but people have deliberately obfuscated with MAID because it's an emotional appeal," unquote. I think the emotional appeal and obfuscation here is conflating suicide with kamikaze pilots and suicide bombers. I am taken aback that an experienced psychiatrist would do that. How many kamikaze pilots and suicide bombers are among the 4,500 Canadians who die by suicide each year? This is certainly not an argument based in any kind of evidence or data, and it is indicative of the kind of extreme rhetoric the small group of pro-expansionist advocates employ on this issue. Even expert psychiatrists cannot necessarily tell the difference between suicidality and a qualified request for MAID. Further, the MAID curriculum developed by the Canadian Association of MAID Assessors and Providers doesn't teach assessors how to distinguish suicidality from MAID requests for mental illness, but instead falsely assures providers that they can. This is very dangerous. Of the people who attempt suicide in Canada, 23% of them will make another attempt, and 7% will complete suicide. That means at least 70% of people who attempt suicide only try once. But with MAID, that one attempt has a 100% certainty of being lethal. There are no second chances. There have been horror stories reported in media about disabled Canadians being offered MAID as an alternative to treatment or resources. Several cases were also reported of military veterans being counseled about MAID by the Veterans Affairs Department when seeking help. Such occurrences are only likely to increase if this Trudeau government expands assisted suicide yet again to mentally ill Canadians. It can be predicted that expanding assisted suicide will disproportionately affect women. In the first 21 months since assisted suicide was widened to include non-end-of-life cases, 686 disabled Canadians were provided with MAID. In 2022, a full 60% of that cohort were female. Given research in Europe that shows women comprise 70 to 80% of psychiatric euthanasia cases, and given that women attempt suicide at a rate 2 to 3 times that of men, we might expect this gender gap to widen again once psychiatric MAID is enshrined in law. The government's Gender-Based Analysis Plus, or GBA Plus, for Bill C-62 was not publicly released until after I asked about it during Committee of the Whole in the Senate. This GBA Plus was radically different from that of Bill C-39, the bill that delayed MAID for mental illness the first time. Last year's C-39 GBA Plus was devastating and accurate. It recognized the gender gap in women with psychiatric conditions being more likely to request MAID than men in Benelux countries. It said, quote, "Should MAID be made available in Canada for individuals whose sole underlying condition is mental illness, we would see an increase in women seeking MAID for psychiatric suffering, and at younger ages," unquote. But the GBA Plus for this delay, Bill C-62, is very different. All of a sudden, there seems to be no evidence for anything. Little data on how MAID will impact people who are mentally ill. No data on race. No data on income. No data on how either of those things impacts MAID. Evidence lacking from Switzerland. Too few cases to draw any possible conclusions about why women comprise the bulk of psychiatric MAID cases. And even though women are 60% of Bill C-7 cases, we can't find any possible reason for that. It's ridiculous, honestly. The Justice Department should have just signed a blank paper that said GBA Plus, Bill C-62, the dog ate my homework. Minister Holland has tried to muddy the waters around the process for psychiatric MAID, saying, quote, "This is about deciding as a society to empower people living with a disease like cancer or who are at the end of life, giving them the opportunity to make a choice for themselves. When it comes to incurable diseases, that's the debate we need to have today. We need to make sure that the choice is really limited to cases where a patient has examined all options and where there are no other alternatives to improve their health after having suffered a great deal," unquote. The minister's description is not accurate, as MAID for mental illness is not about terminal illness, and there is no stipulation in Bill C-7 that was passed by Parliament that MAID must be a last resort for these patients, or that they have exhausted other medications or treatments over months or years before applying. This makes Canada an outlier from other countries that allow some form of assisted suicide for psychiatric illness. Now we are at the point where, as Dr. Sonu Gain stated at the Joint Committee, quote, "This expansion is not so much a slippery slope as a runaway train. The government has plenty of signs we should not be proceeding. You can choose to go ahead, but you can't pretend you weren't warned," unquote. Canada is not ready to proceed with the expansion of assisted suicide for mental illness, certainly not now, maybe not ever. But the provinces and territories, under not only Conservative but also Liberal and NDP governments, have told the federal government they are not ready to expand assisted dying to mentally ill people. Canadians have indicated their rejection of expanding the MAID regime on psychiatric grounds alone. An Angus Reid poll last year indicated only 31% of Canadians agreed with this expansion. And in the fall, another national poll found 82% of Canadians said expansion of MAID to the mentally ill should not be considered before access to mental health care is improved. Even the psychiatric practitioners tasked with facilitating access to MAID for their mentally ill patients have not embraced this expansion. The Joint Committee found that a scant 2% of Canadian psychiatrists are even signed up for the Canadian-made curriculum. A recent letter from the Society of Canadian Psychiatry states, quote, "Every survey of psychiatrists since the introduction of the Sunset Clause has consistently shown that psychiatrists across Canada do not support expansion of MAID for sole mental illness. These surveys consistently show that by a 2-to-1 to 3-to-1 margin, psychiatrists do not support expanding MAID for sole mental illness, despite most not being conscientious objectors to MAID overall. And even higher rates by a 4-to-1 margin of psychiatrists citing lack of readiness for MAID for mental illness expansion for March 2024, unquote. Undoubtedly, some of these psychiatrists don't want this expansion to happen because of the duty of care they have for their patients. I'm sure most of them never intended to be involved with the process of ending their patients' lives in a discipline based in trust between doctor and patient and modeled on preventing suicide and preserving life. Senator Kutcher has pointed out that consensus is not required for many medical treatments, physical or otherwise. But assisted suicide is not a treatment. It is death. And in the absence of conclusive evidence about the irremediability and suicidality of mental illness, consensus in the medical community must be required. Providing access for mentally ill people to assisted suicide is not equality. What is actually discriminatory to people with mental illness is confirming their despair and offering them premature death through MAID rather than treatment and support. Mental illness should not be a death sentence. Over the last 8 years, I've heard from so many people who have struggled with mental illness. They want hope and help and support, not an easier path to death. Some proponents of expanding MAID for mental illness claim that this has been mandated by Canada's courts. As a lawyer, I am telling you that is not true. The expansion of assisted suicide for mental illness was a political decision of an activist Trudeau government. Nothing more, nothing less. It is not constitutionally required. In fact, both Justice Minister Varani and previous Justice Minister David Lametti reluctantly admitted to me here that Canadian courts have not mandated the extension of MAID to people with mental illness. 28 law professors signed a letter to the Trudeau government urging the following line of reasoning, quote, "The Supreme Court's 2015 Carter ruling did not involve patients with mental illness. In fact, it explicitly excluded people with mental illness from the judgment, stating, quote, euthanasia for minors or persons with psychiatric disorders or minor medical conditions would not fall within the parameters suggested in these reasons, unquote. Nor did the lower court Quebec judge in the Truchon case pronounce on the constitutionality of extending MAID for mental illness, as the plaintiffs in that case were not applying based on mental illness. Any comments made about psychiatric illness by the judge in that ruling were outside the scope of the case and also can't be relied on for precedent." The 28 law professors summed up their letter this way, quote, "In the absence of binding precedent, it is premature to argue that the Charter requires access to MAID for persons whose sole underlying medical condition is mental illness. It is our view also reckless to suggest that a constitutional right to MAID should and would be recognized by our Supreme Court when there has been no meaningful review of the evidence," unquote. Former Justice Minister Lametti was an activist for the wide expansion of MAID. He chose not to appeal the lower court judge's Truchon ruling because, frankly, he got an answer that he liked. To not appeal such a ruling by one judge is highly unusual for the federal government. The Trudeau government has expanded assisted suicide too far and too fast. Last year, my Conservative MP colleague Ed Fast introduced Private Members Bill C-314 to exclude mental illness from the assisted suicide regime. Sadly, the vast majority of Liberal MPs voted against it. In fact, they voted it down at second reading, so the bill would not even be studied at committee. Only a Conservative government, led by Prime Minister Pierre Poilievre, will repeal this mental illness expansion on assisted suicide. We have committed to this when we become government. For the country's sake, I hope that soon. But I can assure you of this, that will be a matter of not if, but when. Senators, this issue is as clear as day. Either you are on the side of people living with mental illness or you are not. Assisted suicide should never be extended to Canadians on the sole basis of mental illness. We need to put the brakes on this runaway train before it's too late. The Canadian public is not ready. Medical practitioners are not ready. The provinces and territories aren't ready. Please join me and vote to pass this bill, C-62, to help protect the lives of vulnerable Canadians living with mental illness. Thank you.